that some of you all have taken the website and taken it for a spin so that you can get some kind of framework about what it is we're going to go into today. But the thought that we want to start with is that diversity really deserves more rigor. And so as we go through the presentation today, think of the different activities that you engage at your organizations, and look at that against the current landscape. And that's what we're really after. That diversity really demands more rigor, more research, and we think that we have the tool to be able to do that. So James, you can take it away.
All right, thanks. So everyone, just a bit about me. So Karen's our Chief Diversity Officer here at Inclusion Corp. We have a new product called Inclusion Score that we're going to talk about, but this conversation is going to be more about the new ISO standard. I'm going to use a lot of acronyms, but I'll define all of them for anyone who's not familiar with the ISO. I'm going to share screens now and pull up an incognito window to just sort of walk us through sort of where we are in space and time. So the reason for this this presentation, and a little bit about my background for anyone who doesn't know me or who wasn't invited by me. My name's James Felton Keith. I'm a CEO and engineer here at Inclusion Corp. But aside from that, I've spent the past 20 years in what we like to call more recently corporate ethnography or corporate change management. Karen and I actually met advising a few politicians, a few mayors around implementing business processes like Lean Six Sigma. And so again, over the course of the past 20 years, I and a lot of the team that we have here at Inclusion Corp, and specific to the Inclusion Score product, have spent a lot of time looking at organizational change through the process of project management and corporate change management. All of that said, what's been happening over the course of the past 10 years is there's been a large coalition of diversity and inclusion advocates and practitioners who have come together at the International Standards Organization. For anyone who's not familiar with the International Standards Organization, this is the website that you see here on our screen right now. The International Standards Organization builds standards for everything from water cleanliness to quality control to cybersecurity, you name it. And over the course of the past 10 years, and we put a bit of a timeline here on our website, it's at inclusionscore.org/ISO. We talk about the timeline of how we finally arrived at ratifying a standard for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. So when I say D&I from here on out, I mean diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging all together. It just saves a lot of time for me to say D&I plainly. And just to speed through the history a bit, about 10 years ago, I've got an eyelash going on here. About 10 years ago, at the Society of Human Resources Management, about 150 participants came together to draft what we thought might be the first standard in human resources. And we're aware that when people say D&I or diversity and inclusion or diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, they're normally talking about human resources. But this is so much bigger than human resources. It's evolved a lot. Around 2014, we took some of those early standards to the American National Standards Institute. And there was a lot of rigorous debate around what we all meant by D&I. Because a lot of folks at that point, and still even today, mean a lot of different things when they say diversity and inclusion. Following that, the conversation really moved to an international stage where between the Americans and the Brits, a lot of us started coming together to discuss what an international consensus would look like. And from about 2017 on to 2020, or really late 2019, we built the first version of documentation for an ISO standard, the 30,000 standard that we're going to educate you about today, for, again, D&I. And so it's really taken about 3 years. I'll say the last year was really due to COVID. We had a lot of consensus towards the end of 2019, but when COVID hit, it was impossible to meet in our normal fashion to ratify this particular standard. And so like one of our co-founders here at Inclusion Corp is the lead convener. He's a West Coast guy. He's out of Seattle, Washington. But he led the charge across these 165 countries to really author this standard and move it to what we know it to be today. On top of this standard, we're able to leverage old methodologies that we've used across many industries to add more rigor in deploying the ISO standard. So for some of you who've been around for a minute, when you think about corporate process management, I like to go back as far as the assembly lines from the Henry Ford era and move that up into the 1960s to what engineers were calling poka-yoke, and move that up into the 80s to processes like Six Sigma and lean process management, and then move that even further into the 2000s, where we started to see business processes like ITSM, which stands for Information Technology Service Management, and even ITIL, Information Technology Infrastructure Library, on up into today, to where we have ISO standards for cybersecurity and so many things. And what we've been doing as a species over the course of the past 150 years is really trying to streamline the processes with which we deliver any sorts of technology. And when I say technology, I mean products and services, right? And so this ISO standard, which will, as you can see here on the website, I'll highlight it. It says this document is now under preparation for its final publication. So we estimate that by the 15th of next month, there'll be a new standard published. There'll be some press releases around it, et cetera. But the real objective here will be to start to communicate externally to the world what the entire globe means when it says D&I, right? And so we'll get into some of that in a second. But to give you some context on this standard and why it's relevant right now, I got to pivot to some of the latest developments here in the United States. Right now, and I'll go to an op-ed that I wrote recently in a magazine called Property and Casualty 360. In Property and Casualty 360, we really document how the insurance industry, surprisingly enough, to I think some of you at least, are on edge about the piling up corporate diversity lawsuits. These sort of headlines are coming out every week because the risk capital market and really the financial markets are starting to rethink what they think companies are worth or what sort of risk they take on from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, just like they would from any other standpoint. And the driver of this fear is really this chart that you see right in front of you here. This chart is an example of, over the course of the past 50 years, the largest companies here in the US, or the S&P 500, have gone from claiming about 17% of their balance sheets as intangible assets, which are really code for people and intellectual property, relationships that people have, to now they're claiming that about 90% of their balance sheets are based on human power, human trade secrets, people's access to other people, you name it. At the same time, about $1.5 billion of lawsuits are being tracked across every industry at the federal, the state, and municipal levels. So we're looking at places like the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That's a federal commission for the folks who are not here in the US. That's how we look at the national level for discrepancies with regards to employment opportunities, right? So they're looking at retaliation and they're looking at discrimination. So that's to start, but we're also looking at the state level departments of civil rights. We're looking at the city level departments of human rights and what they break out. But this is one of my favorite numbers that we track here at Inclusion Corp, and it's called non-litigation monetary benefits. So these are lawsuits that didn't happen, but they're threats. So these are severance packages that expand when employees leave companies because some sort of, disgruntled effort is presented. And so that number has been constantly rising. And what I like to think about this as, and this is my language, not necessarily formal language, but we really like to think about this as sort of cultural courage. I've seen incidents where certain employees have left a company in a disgruntled way, and then other employees are encouraged to do the same thing if they think they're being treated in the wrong way. And sort of in this era where, you know, women are leading the way, they're in the workforce, the US has a vice president who's a woman, people of color, disabled folks, veterans, LGBT folks, as they participate more and more in corporate spaces, we're just seeing these numbers grow because of the identifiable courage that folks have to stand up for themselves in a corporate setting. So I say all that to say that the insurance industry is keenly aware of this. And so if you're not familiar, every state in the United States has what we call an insurance commissioner, and they convene at the NAIC. If you're not familiar with the NAIC, it stands for the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. About 6 months ago, we got the National Association of Insurance Commissioners to hire in a chief diversity officer. Upon her hire, which was again a little bit after last summer, we all know what happened, especially here in the United States last summer, post the murder of George Floyd and all the activism that had been going around leading up into the presidential election. This diversity officer called a commission of all the insurance commissioners. And again, if you're not familiar with this role in your state, there's an insurance commissioner that is either elected or appointed in every single state. I saw some folks writing in from California. That's California, and right above it is Alabama. Everyone's participating here, even the territories, you know, outside of the states directly. DC is in here. And so on the heels of this commission, the New York State insurance commissioner, her name is Mai Chi Tu, and New York State works a little bit different. Our insurance commissioner works under our superintendent for financial services, but she wrote a guidance a few weeks ago. This was actually on March 16th of this year. On March 16th, the state of New York's regulatory body in the DFS came out with a new guidance, and we've seen this before. We've seen this before with cybersecurity and accounting. A guidance comes out, and then soon following it is a regulation. But the revolution in this particular guidance, written by Mai Chi Tu and Linda, her boss, our superintendent of financial services here in New York, they explicitly talk about diversity inclusion as risk. And that is something that has never been done before. The big difference between the diversity of old and equity, inclusion, and belonging of new is the difference between reactions to crises and proactively implementing process change management. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. How we use standards to transform old diversity efforts into the act of inclusion, into the act of becoming more inclusive over time in a manageable way. There's just one more thing that I want to pull up in this document that anyone can look up. Feel free to copy the links. We'll follow up in email after this with some more links of what's where. But here in the state of New York, there's explicit talk about how we will question and audit even firms that are failing to meet the criterion of having an adequate diversity, inclusion, or D&I assessment. And for the business folks out there, which I think we all are, for the folks like me, this is not about big brothering local corporations. It's really about saying this is a very real risk that we see, and going forward, in order for us to think that you're in good standing, you have to be able to reverse engineer where the light switch is in your institution, so that when the inevitable happens, when the incident around retaliation or discrimination happens, you can show us how you plan to methodologically remedy that, right? So the new world that we're going into is, what is your project management schema? What is your change management strategy to actively engage and become more mature at diversity inclusion going forward? So from there, again, it all comes back to what we have here with the ISO standard. Again, in a couple of weeks, any of you all will be able to, buy the standard, read it for yourselves to understand, number one, how lengthy it is. But as we think about the standard, I want you to think about really 4 categories, not just human resources. And I'll bring in some visual aids to that while we do this. But as you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, I just have to do a 2-factor authentication here, which is slightly annoying. But we've built this particular platform on another ISO standard for cybersecurity, the ISO 27000 standard. And so it's a very cyber, secure platform. But as firms think about who they are from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, they should be thinking in really 4 big categories, right? And they should be thinking about their maturity in that category. So here at Inclusion Corp, per our product line called Inclusion Score, we look at maturity in 4 rungs to start, right? You either don't have anything planned at all, you have some processes engaged, you have a proactive policy, and last but not least, you can prove it. Like you're actually using a control document, an internal corporate policy to engage each one of these 32 risk domains. Aside from these 32 risk domains, just in case they're daunting, it's necessary to really think about D&I in 4 big categories. You have corporate governance. So these are things that executives do and precedent that they set, right? You have human resources, obviously, but human resources per the ISO standard are a bunch of different categories, from recruitment to workforce planning to learning and development to pay, you name it. Human resources is a lot. The third category that you should be considering are product development, whether your product is something you can touch or something you can touch, actual product or service. They should all be engaged via your corporate strategy and your corporate lens for D&I. And last but not least is supplier diversity, or what a lot of places call procurement, right? And so you need to be able to look at supplier diversity, not only from your internal strategy, but also how your external stakeholders are engaging. So if you're a large, complex organization, and I know we've got some people here from big accounting, big, insurance, we've got some folks here from big tobacco, even in different parts of the world. As you think about your institution and how it's structured, you got to be thinking across all 4 of these rungs. And what our platform does is it allows one to take the ISO standard and really change it into project management, right? And as it changes this into project management, it can also update a team around what their focus should be. And so what you see on the left side of your screen here is, your firm versus the industry. And as you compare your firm, to the industry, right? Again, you're here on the left, the industry is on the right. What the platform does in an anonymized way is allow you to pit your firm against all large companies, all small companies, all, healthcare firms. Let's say you are a mid-sized firm, you supply, software, for instance, or anything else to the healthcare industry, you got to meet an RFP, or you supply to a city or a state or some municipality, and you've got a process that you need to meet per the new regulatory bodies raining down saying that they'd like you to meet these standards. You can easily come and show not only how inclusive you are, but how inclusive you plan to be in the coming, days, weeks, years. And again, these policies per the ISO standard, again, they're less about reaction to crises anymore, and they're more about assigning roles and responsibilities, inside of your organization, assigning actions to those roles and responsibilities, and last but not least, measures, or what I just like to call tools and tactics per those roles and responsibilities. And again, you're looking at it from, where you're starting versus the industry. So what you see down here are the top 5 addressable measures that your firm should be taking based on the current assessment. And so to give you some color into what the long form assessment looks like, it's still those same, 32 risk domains, but a company will come in, they define who they are, very basic stuff, what sort of industry they're in. That we use NAIC codes in the States, but if you're logging in from another country, we use codes specific to that locale, right? I'm here in New York today. And so you really start to dig in, bit by bit as you look through these questions across the 32 risk domains. And again, they fit in 4 buckets. You have corporate governance. This is stuff that your executives and management team do. You have human resources. You have product development and delivery. And last but not least, you have supplier diversity. And so I just want to walk through a few scenarios of what this looks like when we're considering, corporate change management. Because it's one thing to tell folks there's a new way to do D&I. And I think right now when people think about diversity and inclusion, they'll think, oh, it means we've hired a new board member and she's a woman and she's an Asian woman, or she's a veteran, or you name it, or she's disabled. Or they're thinking about a side of quotas, which I think falls into the diversity realm. I think there's a lot of great research out to show that we haven't got a lot for our diversity talk over the course of the past 50 years. They'll also think about things like, am I assessing my employees internally to see how they feel about the company, or externally to see how my brand fares and how my intangible assets fare per our brand. Or they'll look at, employee resource groups. Are we establishing employee resource groups at the departmental level? Are we establishing business resource groups? I just want to give some color to this. All of those initiatives are great, and everyone should keep doing exactly what they've been doing. Karen and I we had a client in Boston, about a 500-person architecture firm. On our first meeting with the CEO, and she was really adamant about becoming rigorous at applying diversity and inclusion to her organization, she brought all of her brown women around a board table to talk about the things that they were doing. And they were all doing something in one of these veins, either assessing, they were doing corporate sensitivity training, they were thinking about ERGs. And again, per the ISO standard, all that stuff just plugs into, it's just a fraction of the overall standard. And these sort of tools will allow a firm to be able to manage all of those initiatives and the responsible parties at once. So if you look at, our inclusive culture rung here, right, where it asks, does your team seek feedback on the culture at work from individuals, voluntary task groups, et cetera, et cetera? Is it starting ESGs, ERGs? An assessment taker might come in and say, no, we haven't done this yet. Yes. However, the process is a little piecemeal. It's a little reactive. Or yes, we have a proactive process in place. It hasn't been documented well. Or last but not least, we can upload that control document to say, we are making this a part of our regular project management, right? And that's a big difference. If you can say that you're making a part of your regular project management, you can come over here and look at your capabilities to see, what does this mean? Because a lot of times when we talk about inclusive culture, it seems broad, but per the ISO standard and this maturity model that we have here, firms are able to see explicitly what we mean by inclusive culture. And I don't mean we, like myself and Karen. I mean the consensus of the 165 countries at the ISO, right? So you can see what it means, what the objective of inclusive culture is, and also what your next steps are. So your next steps, this is really your value. This is really, we call this the money tab, because firms, if they've hired a chief diversity officer, or if your diversity team has an elaborate team, or if you're using outside consultants, you're able to come in and drive their workload by understanding what the recommended next action should be per the ISO standard. And again, these questions, they just add more detail to each one of these various risk domains. Staying in the ERG rung, again, they fulfill multiple categories. Now we're down at human resources. We're looking at human resources and the onboarding process. Again, employee resource groups come up again. Employee resource groups are a great thing. I always recommend when I used to consult and go to firms that they try to set up employee resource groups. I remember back in the day, a lot of firms would try to manage their D&I really as a rainbow coalition. They give a director a budget and say, push everybody into one big pot. And what we found via research over the years is that doesn't work well, because people need a at least safe space to interact with like participants to understand how they really find themselves included into an organization. So per the onboarding process, again, the ISO standard asks folks, do you have a process? No. Is it proactive? Can you prove it? Is it a control document that you're trying to manage? And again, you come back down from that scenario into, how do these capabilities, fit in with what we're doing day in, day out? How do these actions stack up? And what does it mean to think about onboarding from a human resources lifecycle management standpoint, right? And what are those recommended next actions? And not only what are those recommended next actions, but what are the measures, the tools and tactics that we want to implement after that, right? So when we think about these scenarios, it's really more about who are we assigning this responsibility to? Usually, if you got a corporation with more than 20 people, right, your human resources staff is differentiated from your product managers. And they're differentiated again from your procurement person or people who are focused on diversity and inclusion. Excuse me, I'm at home today and I feel like outside of my window is a bit New Yorky. So it might get a little loud if you hear people driving by. I think there's a motorcycle riding down the street right now. But anyway, again, so these are roles that are differentiated at a corporation, right? That same small or mid-sized firm that we interacted with in Boston, Massachusetts, the CEO ended up assigning responsibility for this assessment to 4 different individuals. She had a CFO who was responsible. She had someone at the human resources level who actually worked down in the Dallas office. She had someone who was responsible for product, and they're architecture firms, so they offer services and hard product to consider how inclusive they are when distributing this sort of technology. And then last but not least, they actually do a lot of buying from smaller suppliers. So they have a procurement person that they also had taken this assessment to consider how they interact with their supply chain, but also how they interact with partners. So these are firms that they're clients of, like they did work with Harvard University. So they wanted to know how inclusive that institution is, how inclusive some of the cities and municipalities that they deal with are. And so they're asking questions like, does your team plan to develop a workforce that represents and recognizes the organization's D&I dimensions, right, of the customer base? So this is something in the ISO standard that's explicitly asking, if you're catering to a certain community, are you designing products and services for that community in a blind way, or is it in a hands-on way? This particular firm didn't have a policy, but they did have an engagement unit that was actively engaging the communities that they were designing for, right? And so the work for them is just maturing that into a control document to make sure that this isn't something that they regress on, but something that they actually progress on and can identify, that policy. And again, they go from there right back over to the capabilities tab to make sure that that manager can firm up what it means, right? What it means to have D&I development and delivery for products and services, right? To make sure that this is on par with the corporate change management documentation that they're building. The last scenario that I'll go through in this vein is really, and we got to hit this because it comes up on so many folks' radar, just supplier diversity. So supplier diversity is really looked at from 2 perspectives: your actual suppliers, but then also your external organizational stakeholders. I can't help but mention enough that last year, the World Economic Forum's sort of tagline was the stakeholder economy. They were talking a lot about stakeholders, and unfortunately it was a global pandemic and we couldn't be there. We planned to be there this year, and the ISO hadn't been ratified at that point. But there's been no methodological approach to what stakeholders really are. All of that said, when you think about supplier diversity, what our platform enables a firm to do, if you have a lot of suppliers or a few suppliers, you could have 3 suppliers or 300 suppliers, but it allows you to push the platform out to all of your stakeholders for free, and then view an anonymized version. You can't see their policies, you can't see their assessment, but you can see an ecosystem of how they fare versus your firm, so that you can consider in a broad brush way how your firm is planning to become more inclusive across the board, but also more inclusive per the geolocation and the cultures that it represents. And an executive would be able to come and peer down into that ecosystem here in their main dashboard, and they see, okay, this is how we fare. We don't have any green bars yet, so we don't have any control documents that are helping us measure change, but our supply base does, or our industry that we're trying to comply with does. The last but not least, portion of the ISO standard that I would bring this to is, as governments start recognizing the ISO and implementing policy similar to what the state of New York has already done, they'll start looking at compliance across the board to see where an entity is available to scale, right? And so that's one app that we have. Aside from that, we've tried to make this friendly to to everyone who's participating sort of in this space. So while on one side we talk to a lot of large corporations about how they may quickly assess a large portfolio of participants, but while this is business culture that we're engaging here, a bit of this is activism around inclusivity, right? And we want to see the existing workforce of small consultants that exist out in the world be able to continue to manage their portfolio of business and scale it, especially as they have differentiatable skill sets. So this is a second app that we launched just for the small consultants of the world to be able to manage multiple clients. So this particular person, this is actually Tawana, who some of you all probably know, or who's been interacting with folks as they register for the event. But she's got 2 clients, and one is taking the assessment. And this is an example of a snapshot of their inclusion score per the ISO standard. It's a score based on a 4.0 scale, which a lot of people familiar with academia or who have kids can understand. If your kid has a 0.7, you're not that proud of his score. But at the same time, it's necessary to contextualize this here, in that this is about having and being able to communicate a process with which you plan to get better from. So it's less about where you start and the assumed embarrassment of where you start, and more about saying, hey, we're in a new era and we have a strategy to scale over time. So I know I said a lot, and I want to dial back for a bit to see if there are any questions about, from the crowd, about just, where we are and how this might be deployed. Questions about the ISO standard, questions about the new regulations that are coming out of places like the state of New York, you name it. So anything in that vein?
We don't have any questions posted, but when we think about some of the other entities that we've engaged, they take a day or 2 to process it and then come back with the same questions. Why the ISO? So like if you applauded us in the beginning, saying that we're engaging activities that effectively are on our road to diversity, why should, just because 165 countries ratify something, how does that impact me? Where should I start? So these are some of the questions that we always get that people may have a little bit later. Maybe we can address those now.
Sure. I think the main reason is, the ISO is really about consensus, right? So per the risk capital world, some of our earliest engagements, some of our earliest clients were large insurers and brokers. And their biggest fear going forward with diversity and inclusion was that we weren't all speaking the same language. So a lot of this work going forward has been about figuring out a way for us to speak the same language so that we use the same nomenclature to identify risk buckets, right? So the ISO was really an effort to find consensus. And, it took a while, but finding consensus and then being able to add more methodologies like this maturity model to it has now allowed people in the ESG space. And for anyone who doesn't know ESG, in the finance industry, new sorts of financial products are being designed around environmental sustainability and governance, which means firms want to invest in firms that are more inclusive, better custodians of the environment, and have adequate corporate governance to facilitate that. And there are all sort of new indices that have come out that show, even when you look at the S&P 500, the most inclusive companies of the S&P outperform the S&P 500 by multiple percentage points, right? And so the main pressure for this has been our culture has changed with how we engage process management. The financial industry has taken note because there are real risks identifiable with lawsuits. And so first things first is we need to make sure that we're speaking the same language as we try to vet how we gradually become more mature as a culture of businesses in multiple countries.
I appreciate that. We have another question from Sandra, and she wants to know about certification. So we take all this information in. Can a person be certified in DEI?
So two things about certification. On one hand, you have the institutional certification, right? And that process, I would say, is going to be about a 3-year process. And I'm comparing that to the ISO 27000 standard, which is the standard for cybersecurity. And the reason it takes a while is because you have to do your self-assessment first, your internal assessment, right? And depending on the complexity of your organization, you're getting consensus across a lot of different parts of the institution. And then you'll have a third party org come in and vet you, which this will reduce your costs because you can actively have them come in and look at where you're good and where you're not, and just check off the places that you need to grow most. They can look at your policies to see if they're on par, right? But I would still say it will take multiple quarters, I would say up to the 3-year mark from when you start to get certified as a company. Separately from that, we've been working with trade associations and with governments to certify individuals. So on our website, and we'll regularly update more information on this, we offer a variety of rungs of certification for individuals to want to be assessors and or auditors in the D&I space, right? Because when we look at other ISO standards, right, whether we're talking about the 27000 standard, the 9000 standard, which is the quality standard, auditors who audit institutions that want to be certified have to be a certified auditor. So we are the first institution to offer a standardized process for individuals to become gradually more competent in the ISO standard over time. So the answer is yes, but we imagine that as more people become certified over the course of the next 2 calendar years, we'll start to see the most ambitious companies start to become geared up to be certified, I would say by the 2024, 2025 calendar year. So yes. And we'll be following up with a bunch of you about those certification processes. Yes.
And so thanks for that. Kim is asking, what has the feedback been on the entities that have adopted the ISO? And it's, so the question is kind of preliminary because, as we know, the ISO does not officially come out, but we can talk about our reception and the companies that we have started out with. You can speak to that.
Yeah, so a lot of companies, again, even though the ISO will be ratified and pushed out, again, I'm pretty certain it's going to be the 15th of next month. We've been building this out for about a year, since July of last year. And companies obviously are already engaged in D&I efforts. So a lot of firms that came to us early just saw this as a sensible way and an inexpensive way to manage all of their existing efforts, right? They look at it as project management. And his response has really been that now they have a better idea of how to scale services in an a la carte way. So instead of paying, and no offense to Deloitte, there might be one or two of those folks on here. I know we have some of their competitors on here, but instead of paying, you know, a company a blanketed, you know, a couple of $1,000,000, you come in and start to understand where your exposure is and where you want to focus that consulting. So I would say in our experience, they enjoy that the most. The next best thing that they see as a response is just this getting them on a path to compliance. And the third, and depending on what sort of org you are, I would say the most significant part has been orgs being able to come out and say emphatically that they have a comprehensive approach to becoming more inclusive over time. I think what we've seen from a PR standpoint, and for those of you who are familiar with me, you know that I'm a bit of a retired politician. You know, communications are important. And firms do want to come out and say, hey, we know we don't know everything. We know we haven't gotten it all right, but we do have a process per this new system to gradually get better over time. And so some of our early adopters have not just been trade associations and mid-sized companies, they've also been cities. So we've got a few cities in the Midwest, the one I'm sitting in here right now on the East Coast, and a few others, you know, 2 European cities who are leveraging this as an opportunity to have a conversation about a comprehensive approach to D&I. I should also say we've had some county sheriffs who organize policing across multiple cities come in and look at the standard as an opportunity to not just look at how you might retrain your core staff who distribute your core product like officers, but how you start to gradually restructure a broader corporate culture via sort of this standardized assessment, right? So they're looking at the support staff, they're looking at HR, they're looking at procurement and supplier diversity. So the response has been, you know, surprisingly awesome. It's been, you know, obviously none of us could have predicted that video that we were going to see out of Minnesota last June. But on the heels of that activism, you know, I led a big march right here in Harlem. We had 20,000 people in the streets, you know, after George Floyd's murder for a huge Juneteenth celebration. And everyone was there. It was a real motley crew of everyone who lives here in New York. Obviously, we live in a huge melting pot. But the response to that really triggered the response to this new framework coming out and this new product. So a lot of our feedback is that this is surprisingly timely. The rigors of it are just institutions trying to figure out how do we implement, who do we make responsible, and how do we gradually go to market. And the fact that we've created this, you know, cyber secure cloud-based platform is, I think, another benefit to them because they can gradually do that over time. This isn't about taking an assessment to do a press release with tomorrow. It's about starting the assessment and figuring out who you need to make responsible for it, the control documentation that comes out of it, and the employee and customer engagements that you have after you have those control documents. So it's been surprisingly well received, especially per the times. Yeah.
So I have another question from Keith. He's asking, you know, what are my next steps? That was kind of a broad question, but we certainly can answer that a number of different ways. How you engage us next, you know, what you should be thinking about after taking this webinar in.
Sure. I think, so Keith, you can go straight to the website now and kick the tires on this thing right now. You can just click sign up. We'll obviously, you know, follow up with everyone via email. But depending on the type of institution you are, we really deal with 4 different types of institutions: governments, trade associations that manage a lot of different types of companies that want to push this out to that portfolio of entities. Then there are large corporations. And then there are, you know, SMBs, small and mid-sized businesses that usually supply to those corporations. The product is the same for everyone because this really is about getting everyone down to the small 20-person, you know, team to start to at least think about D&I because they may grow, right? And so I can tell you, and again, this particular conversation was more about the ISO standard than the product, but these two tabs that you see right here, this dashboard and this main assessment, this is free for anyone right now. So you can start to get your head wrapped around, you know, where you might want to go. For all of the tabs, it's nothing but $100 a month for you to start to really dig into what your capabilities are and what they aren't. And to see not only your firm, but your supply chain, it's a $500 product a month, right? So you're not only looking at your firm, but you can upload contacts, you can upload a CSV file, you can have your procurement person say to your 100 suppliers, we're making a concerted effort to get better. And so we'd like you to consider the same thing. Now, aside from that, Karen's team, Karina's team, what you see on our website, F&S's team, we deploy a large suite of hand-holding and consulting specific to D&I to walk any firms that need it, not only through the assessment, but what they do after the assessment, you know, how they actually create these policies. But we have done some work in streamlining the way the industry interacts with this. So you've got a lot of great companies in Texas and California and Montreal and London and Copenhagen and Paris and Mexico City talking about D&I from different perspectives. Depending on where you're deficient, right? We can offer you a suite of those particular products, right? If you're looking at performance management and you're pretty deficient there, actually, this is a bad example because this company is doing okay. But if you think about recruitment, where you don't have anything, our ability to have our consultants and our automated system hand you off to a bucket of product and service providers that help you get better at what you do are right there inside the platform. We got about 2,000, of those firms signed up. And so I would say it all starts with, you know, going to the platform, doing a singular sign up. It's one sign up per firm. So if you sign in, the next person with that same email address will probably be rejected unless our account management team is interacting with you directly. But after you sign up, we'll see how you fare on the basic assessment and then explore what you really need, whether it's more consulting, whether it's third-party vendors, or you name it. So it's as simple as that, really. I think, you know, in this era of large platforms, we're just trying to platformize D&I, streamline the nomenclature of how we look at change management through D&I so that we can both manage that risk, but also when we can't, or when we're too early as a company, we want to transfer that risk, which is why the insurance industry and the government care about this. But again, it's just like auto insurance. The government and the insurers are going to rain down and say, if you can't show us that you can manage this risk, then your risk premium, that policy, will go up. So a lot of the new conversations that we end up having, and this is a bit of a run on, I don't know if there are other questions, but I just want to add some color to this.
Yes.
A lot of the conversations that we're having with the COOs, CFOs, CDOs, Chief Diversity Officers of the world, are more about having a conversation with their HR, product, and procurement people, right? To communicate to them, if you can't help us build more process and control documents here, and we have a process that's easily digestible and roll, you know, you can rinse and repeat for any part of your organization. But if you can't do that, then you make this all more expensive for the company. So this is actually one of our experiences, and this may answer one of the earlier questions. One of our best experiences has been, we've seen the financialization and the regulatorization, if that's a word, of this incentivize more diversity and inclusion activity at a firm. And that's been a really prolific thing, especially for those of us who do fit into a minority or disenfranchised category, who want to see real actionable steps so that we not only know that we have more access to opportunities later, but, you know, our young people will have, you know, more access to opportunities later. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Craig has a question in our remaining moments. So he says, another area for DEI is budget and resources that are dedicated to implement changes. How can we leverage this product to support the budget and resources conversation?
Right. So I think the first place you start is being able to segment where you want your budgets to go. So I think often when firms start with budgeting, they have either a blanket idea about what they want to spend, but this will help, I think, parse it to say, because we're really lacking in government bodies, and we need to hold a convening, a caucus of our top level management, we want to budget some resources here to get them together. Because we do relatively well in this, designated responsibilities, we have some documentation, we'll pull back from there and we'll focus, down here on the HR management lifecycle for workforce planning, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the first thing that it does from a budgeting standpoint is it allows a firm to be able to segment where their budgets go and manage each one of those segments to not only understand what sort of products and services they need to apply to it, but also what sort of staff go there, what sort of existing staff can cater to that, and what sort of new staff comes over. And I can't stress enough how, again, in our experiences with firms, how this has been a benefit to firms who already have a well-trained staff from a project management standpoint. This is just like giving that PMO a new shared task to help you roll out the gradual maturity of your D&I purview from a governmental HR product and supplier diversity standpoint. So that's number one. Number two, there are some upgrades directly in the app that show real risk based on industry lawsuits and some other data points that we pull in to help a firm get ahead of how they should be budgeting. So, they can actually see the dollar amount of risk domain by domain over time as they become more or less mature in that domain. So again, I think it helps with overall strategy, and we try to look at this as a project management tool. Oh, Karen.
One last question, and then we'll wrap up. Heather wants to speak to how the ISO and certification standard work in relation to each other. So the ISO is here, and then so how is my certification journey going to go? Briefly, because I have one more question that just came in.
So I think the certification journey will go. It's a series of training, a series of education. We do some very basic education, like if you think about Six Sigma green belts, it's usually like a 1 or 2 hour education overview. And then there are 3 upgraded sort of classes that go along with that are based on the standard, so that the folks receiving the training become well-versed in what all of these risk domains mean first. So it's a basic training and exam about what these domains mean, so that a firm goes out, an individual can go out to a firm and properly communicate to them what the standard is and how they roll it out. And following, I keep looking at the clock, and following behind that, the sort of last part of that journey is we go through a bunch of rigorous use cases that explain how this is a process management strategy. So if you are a process management person, a project management person, a change management person, this is more designed for you. If you're not that sort of person, if that's not where you've worked in an organization, this will gear you up in that vein. And it'll just be, again, another tool in your toolkit, just as PMBOK principles are in the PMP space, or IDLE certifications are in the IT space, or Six Sigma certifications are in the broader engineering process space. So it'll look very similar to those processes. It's 3 to 4 classes, depending on, what sort of cert you want to get. And per our trade association partners, depending on where you live, where you're working, and what industry you're working in, we can partner these with those associations, because these associations are now starting to look for individuals in their locale to be able to administer this alongside them in the locale. So like when we're in Detroit, while we will, if there's a capacity need, in-source folks from, Massachusetts or Mississippi even, right? We would love to just bring in people from Michigan. So that's how the path looks. And then it's just, a stamp of approval that you can, brandish wherever you deem necessary, on your LinkedIn, etc. And then we offer some other resources, which this has probably kicked me out. Yes, kicked me out. But we offer some other resources to help funnel workflow, because we're starting to get to the point where we're becoming overwhelmed with need for consulting to handhold firms as they walk through the assessment process. Sorry, Karen. I feel like I took too long with that.
Okay, so we're right at the hour. We have another training to give, and so if for the remaining folks, please, reach out to us on LinkedIn. You can email James or myself. I've put our contact information in the chat, and just stay with our page. James, any closing thoughts while I put your email address here?
Yeah, no, none directly. Just again, we're going to follow up with everyone in email. And again, if anyone asks you about where D&I is going, it's about corporate change management. Like, that's the new wave is risk and corporate change management. So what corporate change management processes are firms using to manage risk before they have to transfer that risk? And that means transfer risk means a policy, like an actual insurance policy. You don't want to have to go to that wrong. So again, that's sort of the innovation that we're trying to harp on the most. The new wave is corporate change management, not just, reactions to crises that have happened from a D&I standpoint. So thank you, everybody. We'll be in touch. Feel free to email us or text us. We look forward to, keep the conversation going.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.